Bonjour. That is about the extent of my French. So we have a translation service available, I believe, and I'll try to speak slowly and make sure that not too much is lost in translation. So again, thank you for coming. I'm John Herrema. I'm the SVP of Corporate Strategy for Good Technology. I've been involved in mobility and enterprise mobility in one way or another for going on 18 years now. I started actually in mobility with Sprint PCS back in 1995 when that company was first starting up. I then spent some time with Microsoft, and then I've been with various incarnations of the Good Technology company for going on about a dozen, or actually 13 years now. And so it's been really incredible over that period of time to see how much and how rapidly things have changed within really the last 3 years. And the degree of change, leads us to wonder, is this massive change we've seen, is it a catastrophic event or is it a change for good? And I think like most big events and most big seismic changes, the answer is always a little bit of both. And so I think as we go through the presentation today, hopefully we'll be able to share some thoughts on some of the challenges, but also a lot of the opportunities. And when we think about, when is the day? And as I said, I've been involved in enterprise mobility for 15 plus years now, and I've seen everything from 9.6 kilobit per second networks back in the early 90s, all the way up to, 4G, LTE, so on. But I have to say that if there's one day, one single day, over the course of that very, very long period of time that changed everything, it was the 29th of June in 2007. And I think in many ways, from a mobility standpoint and from an enterprise mobility standpoint, it was a little bit like the asteroid coming down from space and hitting the planet and causing immediate and seismic changes. And that event was the introduction of this particular device, the iPhone. It literally changed overnight what mobility meant, not just to consumers, but because of that, what mobility meant to enterprises and IT professionals and chief security officers and everybody that is involved in some way in mobility. And some of the reasons for that change, you have a few things. At a very technical level, these modern OS platforms, things like iOS and Android, they're based on a fairly different model than some of the earlier platforms. In the older platforms, things that go all the way back to Palm OS and Symbian and early iterations of Windows Mobile, you had an architecture that was based on a single file system. As a developer on that platform, you had very deep access into that platform, and you could do almost anything you wanted from a command and control and security standpoint. You could build device management agents that could do almost anything you wanted on that device. You could change the entire look and feel. You could monitor low-level activities. You could do amazing things with these platforms. Well, today, and these platforms are very different. Generally speaking, they're based on a sandboxing model, which means that applications run in their own space, and then they have very defined ways for how data is shared between those sandboxes. As a developer on that platform and somebody writing software for it, you typically don't have deep kernel access, very low-level access. And to the extent that there is any kind of mobile device management or MDM framework on the platform, it's generally defined and controlled by the platform provider. It's not like the old days where folks like Good Technology and other vendors could go deep into these platforms and really control them in a fine-grained way, almost any way we want. And the reason for a lot of these changes is because these modern platforms are all about consumer experience, they're all about applications, and they're all about enabling what the consumer wants out of the box, not necessarily what we as security professionals or IT professionals might want. They're fully geared around the consumer. And as a result of that, you have this very interesting challenge now, because a lot of the techniques that we used to use back in the early 90s and late 90s and early 2000s were based on the idea that I can go into this device, I can lock it down, I can control every aspect of its behavior. I'm the one, as the IT department or the security professional, who gets to decide what happens on that device. Very, very different. And just to give you one example of how things have changed, back in the old days, if we wanted to prevent what we might call bad behavior happening on the device, we could actually use a technique called blacklisting. And what blacklisting is you could set policy and you could go in there and you could say, I only want these applications to run on the device. And I don't want any of these other blacklisted applications to run on that device. Now that worked pretty well back in the late 90s, 2000 timeframe, when on a given mobile platform, you could count the number of applications that were available, sometimes in the tens, sometimes in the hundreds, maybe in the thousands. A platform with a very rich ecosystem back in that time frame might have had 1,000 applications, 5,000 applications in total. So the idea of managing a blacklist, although somewhat tedious and maybe difficult, was something you could at least conceive of doing. We now live in a world where between the iOS platform and Android platform and other platforms, there are easily 1 million to 2 million applications out there now. And more importantly, there's a new application showing up on these platforms every 90 seconds. So even if you could somehow survey the millions of applications that are already out there and even begin to try to build some first version of a blacklist of what should be allowed or not allowed, if there's a new application coming every 90 seconds, how can you possibly maintain that going forward? Whose job would it be to look at these applications that are popping up every minute, every day, and somehow determine whether or not they should be allowed? And so that's what's so very different about these modern platforms. Some of these old techniques that we used to use, they're just not practical, even if they're available, because many of these platforms today do still support the concept of blacklisting. Even though it's available, it's just not practical when you have a new application showing up every 90 seconds. So we talk a lot about this phenomenon of bring your own device and how that has changed things. Because, as I said before, there are challenges when you have these big changes, but there's also opportunities. One of the great opportunities around this bring your own device model we're seeing is that you now have the opportunity to extend mobility to almost every one of your employees. And you can probably afford to do that now because the user themselves are bringing you the device, and they're typically paying for a data plan now. They're typically paying for their own voice plan, and they might already have 1 or 2 or even 3 devices in their personal life. So that's a tremendous opportunity, because back in the 90s and in the 2000 timeframe, a company with a large mobile deployment might have been deploying to 15 or 20% of the company at most. They simply couldn't afford to put mobility typically in the hands of every one of their employees. Now we have the opportunity to reach almost every one of our employees with mobile access anytime, anywhere. And what's even more interesting about this BYOD phenomenon is that it also extends not just to your employees, but also your business partners and potentially your end customers themselves. And so to give you an example of that, one of our large customers is an insurance company in the United States. They have about 25,000 people that sell their products who are not their employees. But these are independent contract agents who interact with their end customers and are doing business for them every single day. They're just not employees. The great thing about BYO and the great thing about mobility for this company now is they know that every one of those agents has an iOS device, or maybe an iPad or an Android device in their pocket right now. And so for the first time ever, they now have a means to cost-effectively extend business process and workflow to those 25,000 business partners they have in a way that they could never do before. And so that's what's great about this whole BYO model. It's not just about reaching more of your employees with productivity. It's about how do you extend business process to your employees, but also your business partners, and maybe even your end customer. And it doesn't stop there. Is it just about bring your own device? No, we actually now live in a world, because of this App Store phenomenon, where we also have what you might call BYOA, bring your own application. Users are coming into the enterprise, and they're saying, in my personal life, I'm getting a wonderful productivity out of things like Evernote, or maybe a PDF annotation application from a company such as iAnnotate. Or maybe they're using something like Dropbox in their personal life. And they're saying, why can't I have this similar experience in my business life? And so they're not just bringing in their own devices, they're also bringing in their own application. The other interesting part about this is when users are bringing in and trying to bring in these personal applications, part of the reason they're so appealing in their personal life is that the applications are just really cool. And the user experience is really, really good. And these are very productive applications for them. And so what we're seeing with our customers and many of the partners we work with is the end users are actually now becoming more demanding on the enterprise. And they're saying, if I can have something like Evernote in my personal life, why can't I have something like that in my business life? It just doesn't make sense. If I can have this wonderful productivity and this great experience in my personal life, how come my business applications don't work the same way? And so we're seeing some interesting pressure on our customers, not just to provide applications, but to also provide great user experiences, very efficient applications, very productive applications. And this concept goes on. So we have bring your own device, creating pressure. We have bring your own application, creating pressure. There's also the notion of bring your own cloud. You know, users are using in their personal life services like iCloud and Box and Dropbox and so on. And again, they're asking themselves, why isn't my company providing me something similar in my business life? And then you have this notion, which we think is going to be very interesting over the next few years, of what you might call bring your own identity, where services like LinkedIn and Facebook are providing what you can think of as single sign-on type of infrastructure that allows users to seamlessly move between different personal applications using a single identity. And then again, they come into their business life and they're asking themselves, if in my personal life I can have a single identity that works across all these different applications from all these different companies, why can't I have that in my business life? So all these trends are creating more and more pressure on IT to provide equivalent experiences for the user in their business life. And to some degree, this is also creating a model where users are more in control of the situation in many cases than IT is today. When users are bringing in these devices by the thousands into the company front door, what we're seeing with our customers now, is that decisions around platform choice, for example, iOS versus Android versus other platforms, are actually being made by the users based on what they want and what they value most in their personal life. And that's becoming hugely influential on IT decisions. We're also seeing this idea that when users start to experience things like Evernote or Box or Dropbox in their personal life, again, they're going back to the company and saying, if you can't give me something that's just as productive in my business life, then I will work around you. And what's interesting about this phenomenon is that the users typically, sometimes, but typically are not doing this maliciously. They're not trying to work around IT or the company because they have bad intent. They are literally just trying to be more productive for their company, get more business done, be more responsive to end customers. And so again, That's a challenge when the users are somewhat threatening us to say, I will bring my own solution if you don't give me one. That's a challenge. But there's also an opportunity there, because the users are basically telling you, I just want to be able to work better, more responsively, and more efficiently for the benefit of the company. And so what they're really doing there is there may be a little bit of a threat implied there, but they're also asking for your cooperation. They want you to be able to say yes. And so what we're seeing with many of our customers is rather than fighting that and resisting that, it's actually, they're taking the approach of embracing that and working with the end user as a partner to actually provide them solutions. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So just to focus in a little bit more on what is often positioned as the answer to some of these challenges, this notion of mobile device management. And I think one thing that's very important to understand is that in this new world, your risk from a security perspective and from a compliance perspective typically isn't about the device itself. It's more typically about the data, your business data, and the applications that that data is being used in. And so to expand on that a little bit, what's very unique about today's platforms like iOS and Android is that people are using them almost primarily because they're application platforms, and secondarily because they happen to be able to do voice or texting or more traditional mobile telephony. And what's interesting about these platforms is that in many cases, they're designed from the ground up in combination with applications to make it very easy for data to move from application to application, and in many cases, to actually move from the device itself off into the cloud. And the challenge we have here is that end users think of that as a feature. When I can take data that shows up in one application, easily move it over to Facebook, and then move it from there perhaps into iCloud, for your typical end user, that's called a feature. That's a good thing. They want that data to be able to move freely between applications. It makes them more productive in their personal life. But the challenge you have as an IT professional or a security professional, what the user might think of as a feature or a benefit of the platform, many of us would qualify as a data breach. Because if data, business data, moves onto the device, and then from the device off into Facebook or off into Dropbox, that's a bad thing from an IT security and compliance perspective. It may be a very good thing from the user's consumer experience. So you have this challenge where the risk doesn't stop at the device itself. And that's because many of the applications on the device, and even the devices themselves, are designed to share and replicate data with other devices, and very importantly, with the cloud. Things like iCloud and so on. And so it forces us to now look at security very differently, because managing the device is not always enough anymore to guarantee security. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I'm curious, in the room, how many of you in some way are responsible or involved with mobile or mobile security or policy for your company? Okay, a good portion of the room. How many of you traditionally have viewed device wipe as, one of your key security measures for mobility? A similar, almost the same, not quite everybody. So we have this idea traditionally that device wipe equals security. If somebody loses the device or it's stolen, I issue a wipe command and everything's okay. Maybe. Because the challenge we have here is that if data is moving from app to app to app, and potentially from the app itself off into the cloud, maybe that doesn't work so well. We also have an interesting challenge, and I'd be curious, again, particularly given this audience, where when the user is doing more and more personal things on the device, and where they might even be using their own device for business purposes, The other challenge we have with device wipe as a security measure is that it can actually interfere in a fairly destructive way with the user's personal experience. And so I'm kind of, again, curious in the room, how many folks have had to rethink or in some way modify their policy around device wipe because of privacy considerations or personal data loss considerations? A few. And we're seeing this more and more with our customers. Many folks who started taking this approach are now starting to have issues and questions be raised about it. And this is probably the most important point when it comes to thinking about device wipe as a security measure. The last time I checked, there is no such thing as remote wipe for iCloud. There is no such thing as remote wipe for Facebook. There is no such thing as remote wipe for Dropbox. And I could go on and on and on. Those are just a handful of examples. So I think the biggest challenge we have with thinking about device wipe and this device-centric mentality as a security approach is that if your data has left the device in the first place, it doesn't matter whether you wipe it. Never mind the privacy implications, never mind the fact that you might be interfering with the user's personal experience. It may not work at all. So my view on this is that actually device wipe does not equal security. And that if you are relying on that posture, you're probably, to some degree, kidding yourself about its effectiveness. Especially, again, given this concept that if the device has been wiped, but the data is already off the device, it may not matter. The other interesting aspect of this is the number of devices are proliferating. So a few years ago, we would think primarily about smartphones. And then along comes something called the iPad. And it changes forever our view of what a mobile device is. And so now we have this concept of tablets that's huge and growing. But what I'm showing here on the screen, this is a picture of an Apple design patent around basically an iOS type of watch. And some of you may have seen the Pebble device, which is based on the Android operating system. And so the very interesting thing about these modern OS platforms, like iOS and Android and others, is they're ending up in everything, not just what we would typically think of as a smartphone or a tablet. Now, the good news here, and again, because we talk about opportunities and challenges, one of the interesting opportunities with some of these form factors is our CTO in our company, Nico van Summeren, he has a Pebble watch, and it's got an Android operating system in it. He's actually doing some experimentation with using that Pebble device as a second factor for two-factor authentication. So I've got my smartphone or I've got my laptop, and what I might use as my second form factor for increased security on authentication could actually be my watch. So the old concept of something I have, my watch, and something I know, a passcode. So the good news here is that some of these new form factors and some of these new devices may actually help us make our traditional computing environments more secure. Because we may be able to leverage these devices, for example, as a second factor for authentication that isn't nearly as expensive as, for example, an RSA hard token or an RSA fob. So good news and bad news. More devices means more things to manage and pay attention to, but they can also create opportunity as well. So the reality is mobility is here. As I said, I've been doing this for 15, 18 years now, and the degree of change and the explosiveness of what I've seen over the last 3 years doesn't compare to everything else that's happened over the last 15 years before that. We've seen more change, more growth, and we've truly seen this notion of mobility is happening now. It's finally happened. It's here. We used to talk back in the 2000s about next year will be the year of enterprise mobility. Well, this year is already the year of enterprise mobility. But as we talked about, you have this potential risk where if you do embrace mobility, and you should, but you don't do it well, chances are your data will be leaking. And it's because the way users use these devices and platforms, the way, in many cases, the applications running on the platforms are designed, makes it very easy for data to leave the device or end up in personal applications or other places like that. So as IT professionals and as security professionals or maybe HR and compliance professionals, we need to really rethink how we approach the problem. It's no longer about managing devices. This notion of locking down and controlling and blacklisting and so on, it just doesn't work in this new bring your own world. So what we need to shift our mindset to is managing our data and our applications, because that's ultimately what we can control. The one thing we can do is we can control which applications we put in the hands of our users. We can control how we manage data. And if we do a good job of that, the good news is we probably don't have to manage devices anymore, because we're focusing on what really matters, the applications our users are using, and how the data that those applications require is being managed and controlled. There's another IT challenge that comes in this new world, and it's one of increasing complexity and risk. And part of this comes because we do have this opportunity now to deliver applications to many, many more devices and many, many more endpoints than we ever had before. So back in the early 90s, when I first started in IT, you know, when you were to think about your enterprise and you were to think about, well, how many points might I be distributing applications to? How many people might be consuming applications I'm delivering? Back then, you would think in terms of how many employees do I have and how many PCs do I have? And I don't mean laptops back then, I mean desktop PCs. And even back then, the number of desktop PCs was not proportional to the number of employees. It was actually, back then, a small sliver. And then somewhere along the way, it kind of grew to, well, PCs equals employees, and that's the scale of my enterprise. And then laptops come along, and it gets a little bit bigger. But now we're talking about a world where every one of my employees is virtually guaranteed to have not just one, but more than one mobile device. And again, that's good news because it gives me more opportunity to deliver applications that can make them more productive all the time. Every one of my business partners also has a mobile device, if not one, possibly two. And almost every one of my end consumer customers also has a mobile device. So again, huge opportunity to deliver value and productivity, but now the exponential size of your application deployments could be orders of magnitude bigger than they have been in the past. And so when we think about the scale of deployment now, we're talking about users times devices times apps. And what used to be a subset of my users, a few apps, and maybe a PC only back in the early 90s, is now potentially every one of my employees, multiple devices, possibly all of my business partners, and possibly all of my end consumer customers. And so the scale of supporting these deployments becomes an issue. So what do we need, you know, in terms of how do we get our hands around both the opportunity and the challenge? What Good believes, and what we're seeing with our customers, and I'll give some examples of this, that the key is taking a platform approach. And really stepping back and asking yourself, why am I doing this? Why would I embrace mobility? Why do I want to take advantage of the opportunity? And the answer is because I now have a way for the first time ever to cost effectively put applications into the hands of every one of my employees, every one of my business partners, and as many of my end customers as I might want, and do that in a way that is relatively inexpensive. It's not very costly to build an app for the iOS or Android platform. It can be done for relatively few dollars. And we see that every day. When you look at what's happening on the App Store generally, most of these companies are building some of the most amazing apps for users in their personal life. These are companies with 5 people, 10 people, 20 people. 50 people. It is not an expensive proposition to build an application for these platforms. So that's the great news. But what I need to do is make sure that I have an ecosystem of secure applications, because I can't just have any application being used by my business users or my business partners. I need to make sure they're secure, manageable, and compliant. And so I need to start to think about more of a platform approach to this. And some of the attributes of that platform, you want to make sure there's an application development framework that enables multiple secure applications to be built easily, that allows those applications to interoperate with one another securely so that you can enable business process and workflow. Because one of the things we see in this app-centric world is that a lot of times it takes multiple apps working together to complete a workflow. So to give you an example, that we're seeing our customers use basic applications like email in combination with a SharePoint application and some other bespoke application to implement new business process and workflow. And so the ability for these applications to work together in a trusted way is very important. We're also seeing our customers to handle the proactive distribution of applications, increasingly investing in having their own, what you might call, enterprise app store, where they have a proactive way of managing and defining the applications that they want their end user groups to have based on role. And what we're seeing is many of our customers also extending that concept to their business partners as well. So creating apps not just for your employees based on their role, but also creating apps for your business partners that you want to be able to engage with you in a more seamless and responsive way. And then underlying this platform, you need a management framework. And one that focuses first and foremost on managing your application and data, and devices secondarily. Because as I said before, in this new world we live in, and especially in this bring your own world, device management on its own is probably not going to be the answer. You're going to probably need to do more around managing the applications themselves and your data. And then the last part of this is having a framework where if you have deployed applications to potentially thousands of employees, and maybe even thousands of business partners, and maybe even more of your end customers, being able to see what's going on with those applications, being able to monitor how they're being used, and be able to bring that data back in so that you can better scale and support this much larger deployment is critically important. And so leveraging analytics and being able to understand how applications are actually being used out in the field is going to be very, very critical. And there's three aspects of that that are very important. You have the operational aspect, which is you just want to keep these apps up and running. But it's also important from a line of business perspective. If you do invest in an application and you put it in the hands of your employees or a business partner or even your end customer, you want to know, is it being used? How often? Which features? Which functions? Because you want to know that you're getting a return on investment. And it's also important for developers. Because they want to be able to see how the application is being used as well, because it helps them either target better features moving forward or to fix problems with the applications that they've built. So analytics is going to be a very important part of this moving forward in terms of how we manage this much bigger scale. So if you did have such a platform, what should you focus on delivering from an application standpoint? And this is a simplification, but what we see our customers typically doing is looking at three basic categories. And in many cases, they're starting on the left here initially with basic communications and collaboration, mostly focused on what we call B2E, business to employee scenario. They're just trying to get their employees up and productive with the basic communications applications that they're using every day in their desktop or laptop environment. Things like email, intranet access, IM presence. But what we see that quickly morph into is more enhanced forms of collaboration and productivity, and particularly workflows that involve, for better or worse, the thing that most of us spend a lot of our times dealing with in business, which are documents. So being able to move documents from user to user, being able to implement workflows, and being able to do that when the user is mobile without limitation becomes a more important part of productivity and getting the value out of mobility, and goes beyond some of the basics of things like email and instant messaging and those basic communication capabilities. But the most exciting thing we're seeing happen out there is many enterprises are looking at mobility as an opportunity to fundamentally transform how they're doing business and use it for a competitive advantage, to use it to attract a different type of employee, to beat their competition and to be more responsive to their end customers. And so what we're seeing now increasingly is this notion of starting with the basics around communication and collaboration, extending that with additional forms of collaboration and productivity, but very quickly focusing on line of business applications that are driven by the line of business. Applications that in many cases are outward facing to business partners or the end customer. And that's where we're seeing real transformation happen with our customers. And to give you some examples, just a couple of the results that we've seen from some of our customers who are taking this approach and really focusing on, how do they move from the basics all the way through transformation. So this is an example from a large insurance company in the United States, Nationwide Insurance, and they've been able to streamline their work processes and actually cut time out of processes that people use every hour, every day. And what's interesting about this Nationwide is a lot of times we'll hear companies say, I don't know how to prove that I have a business case based on productivity. What's interesting about Nationwide is they actually have measured and they've been able to put a dollar cost, a hard dollar cost on productivity down to the per minute basis. And so they know that if they deliver a process improvement that cuts 10 minutes off an activity that 5,000 people do 10 times a day, they know exactly how much money that saves them. And so they're taking a very interesting approach to mobility, and the way they're looking at it is they're looking for opportunities to take processes that their users use every single day and to figure out how they can cut time off them. And what they do is they focus on those processes that most users have to use most of the time, because they have a hard dollar savings they know they will get if they can knock 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes or more off a given process. So I think they're a very interesting example of a company that's looking at productivity in a very different way than many of us have, where historically many people look at productivity as a soft savings. This is a company that has measured it and knows what productivity equals to them on a hard dollar basis. So very interesting example there. Another example is coming from a financial services sector, Franklin Templeton Investments. And for them, SharePoint is kind of the focus of how they do collaboration, not just internally, but also externally with their business partners. So they're another example of a company that relies on third-party agents and brokers to actually sell their products. And so by extending mobility out to that existing field force they have, and leveraging the fact that they know their brokers have smartphones and have tablets, they have been able to actually make not just their own internal employee workforce more productive, they've been able to make that extended workforce of these independent agents and brokers they have more productive as well. So in closing, some recommendations, some things to think about. Increasingly, we're seeing our customers and partners think mobile first. So a lot of times when people think about going mobile, they think about taking an existing application and or a business process and figure out how to make it mobile. What we're seeing many of our customers do now is actually think about, what if I were to deliver a business process or a workflow optimized for mobile first? Because that's the one model that I know will work with every one of my employees, every hour, every day, with my business partners and with my end customers. And so by starting with mobile first, many of our customers are realizing that they get more benefit and more value out of an application that they deliver mobile first. And then what they're doing is if it takes off on mobile and it's valuable on mobile, then they know they can bring it back into their traditional environment. So a very interesting shift in the thinking, where the idea is use mobile first, and if it's valuable there, then I take it back into my traditional infrastructure. Some other advice, when it comes to security and compliance, you have to always focus on managing your data and your applications first. You should manage devices and focus on that only when it's necessary. Because as I described before, focusing only on device management will probably not work very well as a security approach, particularly in a BYO world. Be ready for more devices and other forms of BYO. It's not just about devices coming in. The cloud is coming in, applications are coming in, identity is coming in. And so think more broadly about what BYO means. Take a platform approach. When you think about deploying technology, that's going to help you get your hands around the challenge, but also leverage the opportunity. We believe a platform approach is best. And I think this last point is very important. You have to be proactive about meeting user needs. Part of this tension between end users and IT comes when IT doesn't give the users a solution to make them productive. So many of our customers will lament about the fact that their end users are trying to use Dropbox, and it's creating problems for them. The first thing I ask them is, well, what are you doing about that? Are you providing an equivalent solution, for example, based on your SharePoint environment, that is secure and managed and controlled? And in many cases, the answer I get is, well, no, not yet. And then you have to ask yourself, well, no wonder your users are trying to work around you. You're actually not meeting a basic productivity need that they have. And so it's very important to understand why your users may be trying to use things like Box or Dropbox or iCloud or Evernote. There's a reason. And so if you're not proactively meeting their needs, they will try to work around you. It's just human nature. And as I said before, sometimes they do that maliciously, but most of the time it's not because they're trying to do something wrong. They're actually just trying to be more productive for the company. So, thank you very much.